Branford Forum. I'm Dan Raven, and thank you all for coming out on this lovely fall day. I know everybody would like to be home raking leaves and doing all those things, but I think we have a great program for you today. As always, we have an email list, so if you're not on our email distribution list, put your name on here, and we'll send you the announcements. There's no obligation, we don't sell it, we don't distribute it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you want to be taken off, we'll do it immediately. So, before we get to today's program, we have some great programs coming up. On November 3rd, Robert Post, the former Dean of the Yale Law School, will speak on Understanding Citizens United, the constitutional question of campaign finance reform. On December 1st, Olivia Dreyer from the Karuna Center for Peace Building will speak on healing and reconciliation in Rwanda. She's worked in several sites around the world that have experienced domestic trauma in different forms, and she's worked to help heal those societies, working with people from different sides of the divide who in some instances have committed atrocities against each other. So I think that'll be very interesting. And on January 15th, that's the first one of the new year, we are co-sponsoring a program on climate solutions from Professor James Boyce. He's from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. So that'll be, it's during the week, it's on, I think, a Wednesday evening, but we'll be here. We are in the process of inviting candidates for the spring program. As you know, we do about one a month, and we have a great lineup. We hope they all come, so we'll be in touch with everyone as soon as that's all set. So today's speaker is Professor Naftali Kaminski. He's the Boehringer Ingelheim Endowed Professor of Internal Medicine. Excuse me for not memorizing that. He's the Chief of Pulmonary Critical Care and Sleep Medicine at the Yale School of Medicine. He's a renowned pulmonologist. He's bridged the gap between genomics and clinical studies. He's extremely well published, and I know him from a previous life as a very prolific and well-respected pulmonologist. However, today he's moving over into the social sciences, and he's going to look at the issue of sex discrimination within the medical profession. So his title is The Role of Men in Fighting Gender Inequality and Sexual Harassment in Healthcare. Thank you.
So, yes, thank you, Dan, for inviting me. This is a pleasure and a lot of fun to speak about the not so fun subject. So I'll just start by, and I'll acknowledge the people, but I sort of put a few photos there. Lynn Filene, who's a faculty at Yale, has been one of the founding members of Time's Up Healthcare, which is an organization aimed to change the situation in sexual harassment and gender equality. She's been very helpful. She's a friend. Arga van Salas, she's a surgeon who has been very open and courageous about the need to completely shift the power balance in healthcare. And Michael Gismondi, who gave me some really helpful slides. And, so again, if you can't hear me, just tell me. We'll try to speak. Exactly. Yeah, I can try. Is this working? Or?
That's for recording.
Oh. So yeah, so basically, I'll basically speak today. I'll introduce a term which is called he for she. It's a hashtag, so this is a social media term, and that's basically, in some ways, I would call it an honorary title. So if you are called by one of the women leaders for health equality as a he for she, you know you've made it. And I will speak a little bit about gender equality in healthcare, and then a little bit about harassment and solutions and why men are so important in the solution. The other thing for myself, my background, as a man, I was born and raised in Israel and did all my medical training in Israel and then moved to the US relatively late in my life and my family. And I consider myself a natural he for she because, as you see, all of my family are really women. So at a certain period in our life, my wife was here, Iris, 3 daughters, 2 female cats. I was always in the minority. And as a kid, my mother is, although we're really well dressed there, I was a kid, you may probably recognize the same time, Jose Feliciano was big. And I saw a photo of this. So I was really in love with, I started walking with dark sunglasses everywhere. I didn't even know he was blind, but this shows you something about biases and disparities. Anyway, but I come from a very low-income East European Jewish family of Holocaust survivors. My mother was a single mother working in a really hard work environment in Israel, so I really feel strongly about gender equality. So what happens actually in the healthcare and what is the issue? So just a little bit of number, they're not really important. The main thing you want to know is women are increasing in healthcare. Female physicians and surgeons are increasing significantly. I think we're getting to around close to 40% in all disciplines. Again, if you look at faculty, this is academic medicine. Basically, all faculty are increasing, but women are increasing more significantly. And we have reached this year, if in 1980, only 16% of faculty in academic medical schools were women, now they're around 40%. So this is a major increase. If we look at basic sciences, again, the numbers are the same, so around 40%, and I'm sorry that some of these slides are not projecting well, but around 40% of the faculty are women. However, if you look by rank, and you all probably could guess it, the lower the rank is, the higher the number of women. So basically, if you get to the number of professors, it's going to be around 25%. And it's also driven by 1 or 2 disciplines that are really controlled by women. So all around the field, there aren't that many women. And the same thing actually in academic, in clinical departments. So if you see around in some disciplines, actually the majority of early career people are women. When you get to the higher levels, it's not the same. So this is sort of what we call the pyramid of achievement. And basically, 56% of instructors are women, 44% are assistant professors, 34% are associate, but only 16% are deans. Now, 16% is a new number. It was like 9 or 5% just a few years ago. When we, again, does not project well, but this is all the medical disciplines, and we look at the chairs of internal medicine departments, or of departments, regardless of the discipline. Again, I'm sorry it doesn't project, but you want to look at this, basically 1% or 0%, right? This is some department. 100 orthopedic surgery departments, not a single chair. General surgery, 294 departments, 1% of chairs are women. I'm glad to say that at Yale we do have a surgery chair, a woman chair, but this is actually a result of the push by faculty to change the game. If we look at scholarly authorship, again, it's not, the numbers are not important, but it is interesting. There's less papers in the academic literature by women. Now, I don't know how many of you have written a paper or read scientific literature, but scientific literature has a hierarchy. The first person is the person that does the work. The last person is a senior person that sort of funded the work. And in the middle, there's a gradient. Usually, women are going to be in the middle. Less women in the end, and less women at the beginning. They're really underrepresented as both first authors and last authors. And this is really, there's actually one journal, and people looked at it, that has not published a senior author paper in 3 out of 5 years. Does it mean that this discipline doesn't have any women in it? Probably not. The same thing, the other thing you may start thinking about it and see why you have the difference is the way papers are accepted is they are reviewed. So an editor gets a paper, says, okay, is it interesting? Is it important? Then he will send it to 2, 3, 4 peer reviewers that will then accept it. And this is actually quite amazing because literally in all the major journals, the number of women reviewers are less than 30%. So you can think of, because of implicit biases and other things, papers written by women are less likely to get in. The same thing about editorial boards. And it's really pervasive in and now the numbers I'm showing you is actually numbers after things have gotten a little bit better, right? So what is the role of men actually in fighting gender inequality in this? And I will stop in multiple places and sort of say, this is something that I learned actually when I became a chief at Yale. My second in command, an outstanding, superbly accomplished clinician and clinical leader, Lynn Tanui, told me, when you enter a room, count the heads. And that's what I do now. When you enter a room, count the heads. And it's symbolically, not only when you enter a room, but in every organization, I go very formally. I look at the room and I say, are there any women in it? Now, as a woman, you probably have noticed it before, that you have entered the room and you're the only woman in the room, if it's a decision-making room. As a man, as part of the majority, you just don't see it. Until somebody tells you, until you start doing the exercise. So for me now, it's really when I get invited to an advisory board, I immediately see that there's no women. Actually, I don't agree to participate in advisory boards anymore if I don't know who else is participating. And several of us have actually generated these email templates that we say, please tell me who are the other members of the panel, and if there's no woman on the panel, we're glad to basically take ourselves off. You know? And this has to do everywhere. Organizing a conference, when you're recruiting, don't be shy of just counting the heads. There's nothing wrong with it. Gender pay gap. So we all know that there's a difference, and you know our Senate and Congress have failed on passing a pay equality law for many years. But even this is not unique to the U.S. Even in countries that there's very strict laws for gender equality pay. In most of them, there's a gender pay gap. This is basically what you see. The dark thing is men. The open red ones are women. This is the rate, and this is the percent of people that actually make. So as you see, the women are stacked in the lower earning phases of the medical profession. This is, again, very detailed, but basically almost every specialty has a pay differential between, the lowest is $2,000, but the highest, I think, is $40,000 a year. Now this is, you may say women are less senior, I showed you the data, they don't have lower ranks, but this is actually adjusted to years and rank and publications and productivity. So this is unequal pay for equal work. Extremely unfair. I am proud to say that when we looked at pulmonary medicine, surprisingly, there was no pay gap, but I think that's because all of us are paid very low. So why are women behind? There was a very interesting interaction between Gary Tigges and Esther Chu a year ago. Basically, Gary Tigges said, yes, there is a pay gap. Female physicians do not work as hard and do not see many patients as male physicians. This is because they choose to, or they simply don't want it to be rushed, don't want to work long hours. Most of the time their priority is something else, family, social, whatever. Nothing needs to be done about this unless female physicians actually want to work harder and put in the hours. So Esther Chu is probably the leader and definitely the founder of Times Up Healthcare actually came up and said, one is the numbers are wrong. You actually don't know what you're talking about. And the other thing, she did something that I think women leaders in the past have been a little bit shy about. She actually encouraged Dr. Tigges' peers and colleagues to shame him. So if you're a woman that works with Dr. Tigges, ask him, do you think I work less than you? And I think this, he actually ended up apologizing, but this position, actually, this view is relatively pervasive in our society. And I think, in a very simple way, what is the role of men? Sometimes it's don't speak about something you don't know, which actually as men, we find it hard to do because we were trained in the evolution to do it. But the main thing is know the data, right? And when you are presented with the data, instead of listening and trying immediately to explain it away, just understand it, just look at the numbers. Because once you understand the number, very hard to actually deny or disregard it. So one interesting thing is, so people looked at it, and you look at early career, because if women and men really were different, they would have different expectations. So if you look at it, women have the same level of expectation to publish high quality research, to publish a lot, to provide excellent care. Exactly the same thing, teaching the next generation. But then, when you look at national and international reputation, leadership, earning a higher salary, actually more men expect to gain this duty. So I don't think that this has to do with necessarily an inherent thing, but mostly almost a realistic view of what's going on. The other thing, although women and men have relatively similar expectations about healthcare, this is faculty, their experience is very different. So for instance, 70% of early career women perceive gender-specific bias in their academic environment. Only 20% men experience this. And actually, many of the men, when they were interviewed, had actually a positive experience about their gender, not a negative. 60% of women personally experience gender bias in academic. I'll go back later to the harassment. So basically, although the expectations from the workplace are relatively similar, the experience is very different. And this has to do also with other things. So women, for instance, have less of a good experience with mentorship in the healthcare and academia. This means that when we mentor somebody, when you mentor somebody, you basically develop to promote both careers, and no matter what you look at, the experience of women was lower. And the same thing, sponsorship. The sponsorship is very different. So when we mentor, when I have somebody that I mentor, I just provide them with advice. When I sponsor them, I actually take an active stand for their career. You advocacy for them, you recommend them to give talks, you push for their promotion, other things. Regardless of the mentor gender, so regardless if the mentor was a woman or a man, men benefited more from sponsorship than women. So these recommendations, these advantages. So again, this is another way that women experience the workplace very differently. So of course you all know about bias. Bias is prejudice in favor or against one thing, person or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. Can be implicit or explicit. Explicit is when you know your bias. You don't like tall men and you acknowledge it. that's common in our society, but because our society has been trained, we usually tend to not to deal with it or not to acknowledge it. The other side of it is implicit, which is we all respect all men. We don't even know why, right? And we don't acknowledge it. So for women, one of the strongest examples is lack of recognition. So when women give talks, grand rounds are very prestigious talks. Usually, women are significantly less likely to be introduced by their title. So if it's me, it's going to be Professor Naftali Kaminski, XYZ. If it's a woman, here is Jenny, right? And it's very common. And this is sort of the numbers. Again, you don't need to sheet the number. The same thing with awards. So this is a study that looked at multiple international societies and look at their awards. And basically, the dark dots are men, and the sort of these dots, which you can't even see, are the women that got the awards. The differences are staggering. And actually, I have to admit, you know, that really, if you summarize, among 14 awards given out by 11 societies in 7 specialties over 72 years. So I cannot calculate the person years there. It's around 1,000 years. There were only 9 awards given to women. At my home base, the American Thoracic Society, we have moved in the last few years to increase. But we look, the most prestigious award, there have been very few women that got it. And what's interesting, over 90 years, there were 2 women that got it very early on. So in years, and then it sort of disappeared. And I think part of it is this moral license. And I think it happens a lot with progress, especially with women. Women have had achievements over the years, but whenever there's an achievement, the fight stops. And sort of patriarchy takes over again. So we need to keep pushing. Women are not perceived as good as men. So women's work is evaluated less valuable than men's work, regardless of quality. There's a lot of studies on CVs. So basically, if you take the same exact CV and just give it a male name, it will be ranked better. That's been studied. Of course, the most famous thing we know is that orchestra auditions are now blinded. And the moment they started blinding orchestra auditions, women's were 25% more likely to be selected. So again, this is a real thing. In my field, again, academic medicine, this is R1 grant review. So one of the major tools of scientific success in the US is, what is getting money, right? Doesn't matter how bright you are, but if you cannot get the grant, you're dead. And they looked at it, and basically, when you read reviews of grants submitted by men, they're different. You know, and there's a lot of, the men are more likely to be described as leaders and pioneers. The women are more likely described to be experts benefiting from a good environment. Letters of recommendations. Letters of recommendation tend to be shorter, raise more doubt than those of men. Definitely there's, again, the use of the first name. So the Professor X that has done this, whereas, again, Lynn has done this and that. And there's a thing. So I actually went through, because I was concerned that I write a lot of letters. So I actually have now a completely, almost a gender-neutral template, which is sometimes I get a comment from the committees that your letter looked exactly like the previous letter. And I say, yeah, that's the only way to avoid it. And the other thing is, actually, when people have looked at women, so for instance, if you ask, and one of the things that sometimes you're busy, so you ask the person who asks you for a recommendation, give me a draft letter. The letters from the women are usually milder. Women tend to underestimate, or some of the women tend to understate their performance, while men overestimate theirs. But you know, maybe actually, when we look at it, maybe women are actually better in academic medicine. I always had, as a resident, I always had this sneaking suspicion that my female colleagues were way better than I did. But actually, when you look at the numbers, one is patients of female internists have lower mortality and readmission rates than those of males. And this was looked also in surgery, that again, lower. Now here's the thing, there's a risk here. What is the risk? Positive bias. So when you try to overcompensate, now you're going to be potentially a little bit more forgiving. We say, oh, they're actually better. So the reason we show this data is more to fight the notion that women are not as good. But I would take this sort of these comparisons. I would be very careful. Although I do think that for some things, there's actually when they mind them, there's some things that make a lot of sense culturally. The other thing that I've learned a lot, and actually, again, I was always as more as a sort of an interested observer, but this was actually presented to me by Dr. Salas, is the idea of the double bind, which is for many women in the workplace, it's damned if you do and damned if you don't. So the idea is that, you know, leadership quality are agentic, I think that's the way you pronounce it, agent-wise, so basically you are supposed to be assertive, ambitious, confident, which is traditional feminine qualities in many societies are communal, so nurturing, kind, sympathetic. And when women behave as leaders, they pay a social penalty. And when women behave as women, they're not seen competent. And actually, I still remember the feeling, again, as a young resident, and we would discuss it, that if I remembered the name of the nurses, I was considered a really nice doctor. Whereas if the female resident didn't really remember their birthday, she was considered a terrible person. And this was the difference, right? And that's why I think, you know, and the same thing is with women's confidence. Again, usually, for instance, that's a good example, and we've seen it also in our politics, displays of anger among women, not men, are attributed to personality and lessen the perception of confidence. Women are judged more harshly in gender incongruent roles, and women that negotiate are judged for it. So if you have a male faculty and he's trying to get a bigger room, he's really good, ambitious. I don't want to use the adjectives they would use about the women that negotiate. So how does this impact? One is there's definitely fewer leadership positions over the women. Women are less likely to speak at the conference, less likely to get promoted. Manuscript and grants are written by women, less valued than limit production. There is the gender gap. So basically there is attrition, and there is this feeling of just you work much harder for the same outcome. The other thing, of course, is implicit bias. I do want to encourage all of you to, if you just Google implicit bias training, there's a really nice website by Harvard that you can test. There are multiple tests on multiple areas, from age to weight to gender. And so I learned that I'm actually, and I think this may be because I come from a family of people that are slightly heavier, I'm actually more forgiving towards overweight people than the American average. So you learn a lot about yourself doing these experiences. And of course, you can see it, but basically there's a gender bias about women being less effective or ready for leadership positions. So the role of men here is really important, and actually it has to do with any minority. Never claim that you're blind to topics. So you're not gender blind. You have to recognize your biases and then act cognitively to counter them. This goes the other ways. You may sometimes give slack to a faculty or a physician and forgive them and ask yourself, is that because it's their condition or because this is your bias? Definitely do implicit bias training and think bias. One of the things that we will do sometimes is When we rank people, for instance, for a job or for a fellowship job, sometimes it happens that, you know, you don't have women or minorities in the top 5 or the top 10. So what I insist is on doing an exercise of looking at the bottom, picking those people and say, is there really that big of a difference that they're not in the top 10? And many times these are exactly these subtle things. Oh, the person was not as talkative at the interview. Just reminding me I'm not interviewing talk show hosts. I'm trying to get really good physicians. So it's really important to think about it and really constantly challenge yourself about your biases. The other things that I've learned over the years, again, some things are cultural. I come from a culture that we cut each other in the middle of the sentence. You know, and if you would sit in Israel in a discussion, you'd think that everybody's speaking to themselves at the same time. But actually, there's rules, you know, and there's a lot of research about that. But if you look at systematically, actually, in every culture, whether this is the culture that has, you know, the long periods of quiet between a sentence to the other, or the culture that, one thing is clear, that women are always more frequently interrupted than men. And the other thing which people have looked at is YouTube, which is cool, which men often get credit for women's ideas, particularly in team settings. Now, we've looked at that, actually, and I now have rules. Whenever we start a meeting, I chaired an NIH meeting on single cell transcriptomics, really high, cool science. And my rules was, you know, wait 30 seconds after the other person has stopped speaking to make sure that you're not cutting them. Don't appropriate their idea, give credit. And the third was, if you're referring to something that somebody else has said, always remember the chain of discussion. Because these things affect women and junior faculty and minorities. They usually get cut off, and then their contribution is not credited to them. Family home life, we're all aware of it, but even in dual career couple, women perform more of household tasks, 65% versus 55%. Even if the woman earns more, of course, increase in education level decreases the inequality, but due to mostly outsourcing rather than responsibility. And opportunities sometimes are not offered due to presumptions about women's priorities. So a good example is we have a lot of outside speakers. And one of the things that has to do with outside speaker, you need to invite them for dinner. And it's very common that there will be this biased assumption that, oh, the woman faculty wants to be with her kids. Let's not overburden her. So we look at it, we actually have you basically have to be 50%. But there's the other thing, which is recognizing item 1, when you're equal here, that means that the woman pays a bigger price. So actually when my female faculty go out for dinner, it's usually a bigger burden on them than on me. So I'm not sure how you handle it, but at least we can recognize it. And in medicine and in corporations, women are definitely less likely to have children than their male colleagues. And women in medicine, this is specifically important because training is so long. And maternity leave is not a universal law in the US. There's a problem with decisions about actually when to have your children. Do you do it during training? Do you do it after training? This is a big issue that actually has not been discussed in an open way. And maternity leave, is, again, as a resident in Israel many years ago, I thought that it was crazy that the female residents, when they were pregnant, worked until the last week before birth, and then got only 6 months to be at home. And then I came to the US, and even 20 years of nobody takes 6 months. Right? So I actually think we need this complete societal change about maternity leave. And maternity leave and maternity adaptation is something that you need to plan for probably a year and different rates, and it should be fully compensated. But if you look at it, median leave is the lowest 3 months, and it's associated with a 20,000 decrease in salary. So it's really significant. So what is the role of men here? One is don't dismiss the data, and recognize the fact that inherently you're benefiting from the hardship of others, just because you're a man and not a woman, right? And I think not all of this is that simple. And this is where I want to draw the distinction, which I learned actually in the last few years, the distinction between equality and equity. So equality is that we give everybody the same thing, whereas equity is what we adjust your condition to you. So the best example is if we give everybody the same size of bicycle, that's equal. But some are never going to be able to ride it. Some actually may be in danger. Whereas if we fit different types of bicycles to the quality of people, then they can participate. And again, for me, it took me a while to understand it. And I think it's going to be a game changer in the way we think about careers in the future. What about harassment? So this is sort of the definition. So this is coercion, sexual attention, gender harassment, and power differential. And the upper three are considered legally sexual harassment. Just a reminder, I think the first laws, I'm now blocking on the dates, but I think the first laws against sexual harassment were in the late 1970s and early 80s. The guidelines of the American Medical Association are from 1989. So again, it's sort of surprising that 30 years later we're still dealing with it. I do think that at that decade between late 1970s and early 90s, we made a lot of, until probably the Anita Clarence Thomas thing. Until then, we made a really big improvement, and then it sort of went back. But here's what's described. That's basically the iceberg of sexual harassment. The upper are sort of the things that are obviously illegal, and most people will hopefully rarely experience, and then all the other things which are sort of discovering, and this came to vulgar name calls and insults and other things. But again, this is really pervasive. If you look at the response, and I won't bother you with too many numbers, but here's the interesting thing. This is the experience of undergrad students, graduate and college medicine students. So I have looked at the literature now. There's numerous papers. There's not a single paper that describes 0% sexual harassment. So basically, there's no place in the world that actually has 0% sexual harassment. And amazingly, is it sort of the lower gender harassment, sexist hostility. Again, the numbers are similar. They're between 30 to 50%. So it's very easy for a man to say there's no sexual harassment, but the experience of women and younger women is very different. Recently, we had a discussion. We were working towards a podcast, and we discussed actually harassment and unpleasant behavior by patients. And one of the senior women said, "Oh yeah, we were last week at the VA, and this older guy looked at me and looked at my legs and said, 'Oh, do you want to hop into my bed?' A patient." So I laughed it off. And then what I was amazed was that I didn't think about it. No older men ever offered me to enter their bed. But the other thing was, I looked at the face of the younger physicians who were in the same distraction. They were shocked. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a gender, but I like the shock, because this means you're not going to take it, right? And And again, you know, of course, harassments have significant consequences on productivity, promotion, feeling safe, and everything. I do want to highlight again the sort of the non-obvious harassment, not the creep but the sort of the small things. You know, people will say, that's what people say, not what they do. Somebody, a senior leader, says women have different expectations. They simply do not want to work as a man. Think about the implication that a junior person feels when that's what they're talked about. This is, patient, can you please call the doctor? Female resident, I am the doctor. The patient, I love your haircut. That's a true interaction. She's so ambitious. This is very common. You know, sort of in a very, and that's actually, the Department of Surgery's hallways are all decorated with pictures of white male surgeons. I remember, I think, Richard Wright speaking about growing up and identifying as a black kid with John Wayne, because all the heroes were white people who killed Native Americans, right, in society, and not recognizing that there were no role models, actually. And the same thing, I think, in academic medicine. It doesn't matter if you walk, they call it the white dude Hall of Fame. So no matter what medical school you go in, there's going to be a corridor with a lot of men. Where do you feel you belong? Now again, as a son to East European Jews, I remember the first time I was invited to a prestigious club in the US, the Duquesne Club in Pittsburgh. It's one of the top 10 clubs in the US. I think they allowed Jews in the late 60s and women in the late 80s. And there's this room, and there's all these people looking at me on the photos, and I said, oh, none of them would have liked me to be there. And I think there is a feeling, so I think Yale has done now a big effort to change these halls. You know, we're not going to be able to change completely history, but recognizing that at least part of the fact that the majority of physicians and scientists we appreciate and learn about are men is not because they were better, but because they had the privilege. So what is the role of men here? And it's very simple. It's when you say something, when you see something, say something. I think there's a lot of sort of mind your own business in academic medicine. But actually, sometimes the easiest thing for the person who gets this microaggression, very hard to respond. You know, you're trying to maintain your stature, you're actually dealing with a sick person. But it's much easier for the person standing on the side and say, oh no, we don't speak this way. And what I've seen actually, and with some of this, again, that's recognition of bias, but with some of the patients you don't necessarily expect, they actually are completely okay. If you say it respectfully, that's not the way, this comment may be considered offensive. Many of the people will just, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Which again changes the whole tenor of the discussion. What are the environmental factors? It's very obvious. You know, if you are in a male-dominated society where there is hierarchy and women are isolated and there is toleration of bad behavior, you're going to have bad behavior. So we need to change these. I'll give a sort of an example. So I usually go in my summers to Europe, spend a little bit of time with my mother in Israel, visit collaborators, give talk. So I was actually in 2018, I was visiting friends in Siena, gave a talk, had a great time. And then late at night came to my hotel room and checked Twitter and saw this tweet. Which was a person who has been convicted of, who has been found guilty by Yale committees in sexual harassment, announcing that they got an endowed chair. Yeah. So I don't want to speak about the specific, but this was a very senior person who had to lose some of his roles in a school because of a conviction and suddenly get an honor. And what I got really excited was that there was an amazing faculty response. Almost 1,000 people signed a petition, open petition to the dean that was public. All the names were public. There were junior faculty with no tenure. There were high holding rank people within the administration. All signed up petitions said to the school, you know, guys, this was wrong. You need to fix this. And indeed, the school reversed the decision. And I thought that this was an example for me of how when you see something and you say something, something actually happens. Whereas if you just go, but again, I know that many of the people who led this campaign were women, but the fact that the men didn't just stay out there, but actually took a very strong position, this is unacceptable, was very helpful. And of course, I actually have usually another, as this year, I think Yale just announced that there's going to be a new dean of the medical school, and she's a woman and an outstanding physician from Vanderbilt, so it's the first woman medical school dean at Yale, and we're very excited about it. So why men? One is impact. Men are disproportionately in positions of power, deans, department chairs, editors. So they are ideally positioned to change the power equation. I'm not taking away the agency from women of changing the position. I'm just saying that men have a strong role and we're very close. So you can when you make this as your position and your stand, you actually change the situation. The other thing is responsibility. The other side of this disadvantage is privilege. So the main reason why we have disadvantages society is not because of statistics. It's not because some people have to be low and some people have to be high. It's because when one group is disadvantaged, the other one is privileged. And systematically and over the years, men have benefited from positive bias, more opportunities, and privilege. So I have no doubt that any one of us, even the people with the most perfect behavior, benefited from the fact that we had an inch ahead in the competition. And sometimes in academic careers, you don't need much. So I can nowadays identify, for instance, to understand why people like me who are outspoken men, even though I'm sort of a foreign medical graduate, had an advantage over women and other minorities, because that's the way it is. So by recognizing that you benefited from privilege, doesn't mean that you feel you're guilty from the disadvantage. It just means that you take responsibility for fixing it. Benefit, it's obvious. The benefit to organizations is obvious, and the sexual harassment achieving gender equity would improve healthcare on multiple levels, from productivity to climate. If you suppress 50% of your workforce, you don't get the same productivity. So it's simply better to work and live in a place where all members are empowered to be the best. The last thing, it's really not a women's issue. It is a societal issue, so that's why men have to be involved. I want to take a moment to highlight Time's Up Healthcare. This was an organization founded by Esther Chu and several other leading women physicians. Their aim is to raise awareness and knowledge about inequity and harassment and their effect on healthcare, make equity, inclusion, safety central, visible, and urgent priorities. They want to unify efforts across healthcare organization disciplines, improve standards, and most important of these things, provide that moving from structures to processes to outcomes, and support and improve protections for targets of harassment. One of the most complicated things, and of course, as you may all guess, with sexual harassment or discrimination, is actually when somebody puts in a complaint, it takes a long time until it's addressed. They never know, they may be targeted, and there's a big risk to careers. And there's also this uncertainty. There's laws that protect the identities of the perpetrators. So the idea of Time's Up Healthcare is basically to equal, so the same way that there's protections for the perpetrators, there's going to be protections and support for the targets. So I'm really excited about them. One of the cool things that Time's Up Healthcare has done is that they actually have been recruiting, sponsoring organizations, and then and partnering organization. And when a university signs up, they have to adhere to their code. They have allies, of course. It's a great group and an important initiative. And so I'll sort of finish with sort of recognizing some of the people. Dr. Agavan Salas, she's a surgeon, an outstanding speaker, and a leader. You can see her Twitter tag. She provided me with some of the slides. I actually invited her to speak at the Association of Division Chiefs, which I was the president, and her talk was really inspiring and transformative. Dr. Michael Gisondi, he also speaks about gender equality and moving again from the point of view of he for she. I'm sort of proud that both he and I are featured on the launching video of Time's Up Healthcare. Dr. Lynn Fenlin, she's at Yale, an outstanding physician scientist and activist. We invited her to our fellowship research day, and this is all our fellows basically taking a photo with Time's Up Healthcare. The other thing actually for this forum, so Lynn has a really good, very interesting research on how to educate teens about vaping using virtual reality. So she's a really good speaker, and a very interesting personal story. So really acknowledge. And then I really want to acknowledge my faculty. Again, you see that sort of the faculty of the LPCCS. It's a very diverse group of people. Highly accomplished, very driven for excellence in clinical medicine, science, education. But they also care about other things. And I think what I've learned over the last 6 or 7 years being here about both gender and other issues and also wellness or well-being in the medical system has been because these people think and they're not afraid to express their view. And they're definitely among the leadership in the country. And the faculty of the Yale School of Medicine, because that experience of actually having the faculty actually take a hand saying to delegate administration, you guys were wrong, is really powerful. We don't have enough in our society. So I'll stop here and I'd like to take any question you may have.
I was intrigued by your slide where it showed that undergraduates have a certain amount of sexual harassment, and then it's slightly more among graduate students, and it's even more among medical students. So how do you understand that?
So one interesting thing is because of the way we operate is the more, so as you know, we're all concerned about sexual assault in undergraduate societies, but the truth is that the undergrad environment is highly regulated. And it's much better today than it was 15 years ago. And I think some of the things that have been implemented at the undergraduate space have not been implemented in other things. For medical students, the other thing is definitely the experience of gender-based discrimination by patients and by staff as an element that all the others don't have. So I think that's also contributes to these numbers, yeah. Mm-hmm. The other thing, again, with changing society norms, I think, who is considered an appropriate target for the predators is sort of shifting. So I think, luckily, our movement has been, or movements in society have been effective to protect younger people a little bit better. But that's, yeah, but there is a shift.
So you gave the this is my last question, so you guys have to. You gave the example of the orchestra where if they're playing behind a screen, then the number of women goes up. I know when you submit a paper, the reviewers are blinded. You don't know who's reviewing your paper, but is there any move to blind the reviewers or the editors to the authors so they don't know the gender or even the institution of who's submitting the paper, and they judge it only on the quality?
So some of the journals have moved to this. It's very complicated. I can tell where a paper is coming in 70% of the cases. And if I don't recognize it, it's actually worse in some ways, right? Because then you have your biases of what's the knowledge level of this group. So I think it's very complicated, but some journals have moved to, if you want to know that, so there's the sort of the alternative blind, which is if you don't want people to know you're reviewing them, you don't get to know their names. But I'm not sure that there's a good way to handle with peer review. Awareness and training. So if peer review was not voluntary, the way it's done today is basically you just get a request from a journal and nobody pays you. But I think if peer review became a little bit more professional, they paid for your time, then they could force you to do implicit bias training and they could look at your statistics. And I think that would be the most important thing. Yeah, go ahead.
I think one of the most important things I heard that really used more emphasis is if you see something, say something. And I'm in the healthcare field, and I've heard professionals gossip, and I use that term in an unflattering way. And there's no reason why you can say that's not true, that's not fair. That person is a high-quality person. And I've seen health professionals do it to themselves. It hasn't happened since last week when I went with the chest cold to see my internist and saw his 30-some-year-old physician's assistant, who did a very competent job. And then says to me after the whole thing, and if you'd like, you can see one of the doctors. Well, why did she say that? I mean, she knew I was a physician, but, why did she say that? And I said to her, look, you did a very competent job. I'm more than satisfied. Let me out of here. And those are the kinds of ways you can see something and say something.
Yeah. So I think that in the workplace, we need a little bit of training how to say something, but I think that's the principle. That's been always my guiding principle. And, being an Israeli, I'm not sure I can avoid it anyway. But when you see something, say something, and I like to add the other thing, you'll actually discover that something happens. So, yeah.
This is just a related anecdote, but all of this happens in other fields as well. And at least 20 years ago, my cousin relayed to me that her friend was a dean at a small college in the Boston area. And when she would have women come in and interview for jobs, and then they would get to the point where they were beginning to discuss salaries, she would literally, the women would say, she would talk about it, and then the women would say how much they would like to make, and then the dean would say, now, let me tell you that men make much more because they assert themselves and they ask for more in this college. I'm going to ask you to please leave the room and walk back in, and we'll start this negotiation over again. So really making clear to people that you do have a right. I mean, this is real activism.
Yeah.
And being an ally.
So the way we handle it with I don't think you should give advantage to the people who negotiate better, regardless if they're men, women,
Yeah.
minority. An immigrant may feel that they cannot negotiate, right?
Yeah.
So our position since I moved to Yale Pulmonary was basically we set up pay. And I was willing to lose talent and not negotiate, especially so at entry level pay. So the idea is that if you come in as an assistant professor, there's an X amount of money you're going to make. There's some incentive, but and that's not I did it also the other way, which sometimes is hard to do, which is a younger woman might say, I'm not sure I need to make this money, but I maybe work a little bit less. And then I would say, okay, if you want to take part-time, that's okay. If you're working full-time, that's the pay. And that's, now, but and the other thing we did was very simple rules, like no urgent meetings before 9 in the morning or 5 in the afternoon. Very simple. So you could actually, by setting a sort of an equal framework, probably avoid some. So I'm really proud because I look at it now, I've been there 6 years, and people who started the same year are making the same amount of money.
Yeah.
There's incentives which are productivity, but it's within, we actually don't have gender gap. So I think some of it is, and I don't think that it's fair to give advantage to people who are extroverts and are willing to negotiate, maybe in business, but definitely not in academic medicine. Yeah.
I'm a little bit of a silly guy. I have a not frivolous anecdote, which I think is so funny. I have a cardiologist, and I think she's pretty special. I think she's a big deal cardiologist. And I Googled her once, and I see that she has 2 degrees in music from the Eastman School. So cardiology must have been a fallback for her.
How are you received when you give this presentation to a group of male doctors? Because I've counted the heads and there are very few men here. So when you're speaking to an audience with more men, especially doctors, how do they take this message?
So it's very interesting. So I had some interesting experiences. One is that when I became the president-elect of the Association of Division Chiefs, I wanted basically gender equality to be our first thing. And there was sort of enthusiasm in the executive committee, but actually some of the male members and some very senior people said, what you need is, we need to deal with economics of healthcare and burned out. So it was sort of a reluctance it's almost like they said, okay, if the organization is painted as a women's organization in some way, right? Which I thought was interesting. Then we wanted to do a podcast on sexual harassment. And that became a whole thing. There was so much reluctance to even engage. So for me, it was an interesting, that's why I say I learned it. So if a senior accomplished man who's actually an extrovert feels a little bit almost dismissed when you want to speak about sexual harassment, how would a younger woman feel, or a victim, right? So this was an interesting lesson for me. I think in general, people now understand that there's this shift, this very strong shift in the public atmosphere with the Me Too movement and actually with women leaders like Esther Chu that don't allow you to hide. It's basically people will not argue and will not say anything. So one of the greatest experiments we had is actually we brought Dr. Salas to our annual meeting of the Association of Division Chiefs, where 70% were men, although all the leadership after me are going to be women the next few years. But she was so effective on inspiring people to be committed for change. And the main thing I think she did was she didn't focus on the egregious, obvious, terrible things. She actually gave examples of day-to-day texts that she has gotten over the years as an example of what can be changed. I was looking at the audience and, many people in the audience said, oh, this could be me, right? And I thought that this was extremely effective. So I think focusing on, one is changing behavior. So many years ago when I was doing dialogue work, I learned, don't tell person you're a racist. Tell them, oh, what you say sounds like racist to me, right? So the same thing I think about these things is don't tell the man that he's a sexist or a discriminator. So I'm very concerned about what you're saying. And here's how it makes me feel. So I think she was very effective. We had a breakdown, and I think many people have been. The other thing is, for many people in the institutions, men and women, it's not clear for them what they can do. So the expectation is there's going to be a law and everything's changed, but laws never change anything. So highlighting this rule of the grassroots of, hopefully there are good laws, but now we need to implement them. And that's where actually I think many of the leader men, they're very concrete in some ways. Give them a prescription, they'll follow it. And that's where I see so people were reluctant initially with the awareness, but now that they're clear this is not going away, they just want to do the best job they can do dealing with that. Yes?
Yeah, do you think there will ever be a time when they will rewrite the qualities of leadership to include some of the feminine qualities? Because actually, when you think of leadership, it should be really represent a totality of the human, which will be reflected in how they deal with other people.
I think it makes sense. You know.
Have they ever discussed that, like at a university, to really rewrite what they're looking for in leadership?
So I'll give you an example. I'm part of a relatively ambitious effort at Yale School of Medicine. There's 3 committees. One is leadership, one is wellness, and one is engagement. And each one of them is looking exactly at aspects of the faculty and what can be done to basically improve the way people feel about the place they work at. And the leadership committee has struggled a lot with eliminating some of the masculine definition of leadership. And I think they came to a very good framework. But the other thing is, people make fun of language. I think language is important. Again, coming from Israel to San Francisco in 1996, both me and Iris, my wife, was here, really loved it because some of the typical sexist vocabulary of Hebrew didn't exist in San Francisco, right? And it was so liberating in the workplace or in other places, right? It was just better. So for me, there was no argument that, your perception of life is affected by language. So one of the things that we've been jokingly, but I think it's serious, is actually there's multiple things that goes with masculine, like in our area, like grantsmanship. Writing grants is grantsmanship. So we've actually been trying to find a word that will replace it. It sounds silly, but I think these things have huge effect. The other thing is, of course, recognize the differences. So when I speak with a faculty and I'll go into a sports analogy, I knew that some of my female faculty sort of roll their eyes, especially if I speak about football. But what I'll say is, this is the analogy that speaks to me. Feel free to bring another analogy into the discussion if you feel better. So some of it is recognized. We're really different, but that doesn't mean that any of the differences makes us better, right?
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.